I look at racing regardless of what the discipline is, whether it's a marathon, ultramarathon, triathlon, swim run, cycling, you name it. It's a giant exercise in problem solving. That's all racing is when it boils down to it.
Welcome to the Low Tide Boyz, a Swimrun Podcast. I am Chip.
And I'm Chris, and this is episode 30, which is kind of ridiculous. 30
Ridiculously
episodes
awesome.
It is awesome. And today we have a guest who really has no business being on our show because he's too awesome. We have Mario Fraioli, the Olympic level running coach, host of his own podcast, The Morning Shakeout, which is the #1 running podcast out there, newsletter by the same name. He's also the last member of the Marin County Holy Coaching Trinity to be interviewed for our show. We had Michael Olzinski, which was our second guest, and then we had Nate Helming, and they're basically the three of them are this huge crew where they're sort of the best known coaches in the
Bay
area.
Yeah.
And so we have Mario on the show to talk about running for Swimrun and sort of his journey, but we'll talk more about that later in the show.
Yes, so we wanted to note about the Ötillö World Series Championship. Now, if you haven't heard for some reason, and you're getting all your swimrun news from the Low Tide Boyz, well...
Which we discourage.
Do
not rely on us for all your news.
Highly discourage that. You may have heard or not that Ötillö has made the very difficult decision to cancel this year's World Championship. And we'll link to all their reasons and how they're doing with if you had a slot from before, what's the situation with that. It's a very, kind of drama and controversial filled decision, but you can find all that in the show notes. And obviously, people are going to
it's a messed up year. It's an unprecedented time, and hey, everyone's trying to do the best they can. But in happier news,
yes,
last weekend, Ötillö Engadin happened, and by all accounts, it was an epic race, an epic weekend in Switzerland. If you're still curious as to what that course is like, definitely check out our course preview episode if you want to start planning for 2021. But looked awesome. Former guest Desiree, first time racing on a mixed team. They won the division. They won the sixth overall or something. It was amazing.
Of course.
So super happy for her.
I love seeing all the Instagram videos and photographs. It looks so awesome up there. And it's definitely bubbling up to the top of my want to do
God.
list.
I mean, it just looks so epic. And apparently we have our insiders. We got lots of reports that there were a lot of cows on the course.
Okay.
So
I was dying to know. I was getting restless sleep.
Yeah.
Speaking of beautiful places to swim run, I was on vacation last week in Lake Tahoe, which is an endurance playground in California/Nevada.
Yeah, somehow I managed not to destroy our podcast empire in the week you were gone.
Yeah, it's always No, it's totally. It was great. I didn't get as much relaxing or swim running or swimming and running in as I wanted, but I had a great time, and I probably made more red blood cells since it's at elevation.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
In my absence, Chris.
I teamed up with someone else.
He's
dun 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 dun.
No.
But true to our pact, I did not tether with this person. But a friend of ours we've been training with, you've heard her name on the show before, Sandrine. We wanted to do a swimrun practice, so we decided to sign up for the Swimrun Edmonton virtual race. Their race was going to be this past weekend as well and got canceled because of COVID. So they were like, hey, we got all these prizes. We got all this stuff to give away. Let's do a virtual race. So we were like, sure. So Team Untethered made their debut. And apparently we won a prize box, so that's coming in the mail from the race organizer. So it was pretty fun, and we did it in an aquatic park in San Francisco. And Sandrine is an amazing swimmer, so not being tethered was good because I would have just been like an anchor.
I'm sure she would say the same thing about the run.
Yeah, it was cool though. We explored San Francisco, went one way, we went the other way, and another run. And just kind of
you went down towards like the ferry building.
Yeah. So we went by like Boudin and like the crab shacks and stuff. And
so in the Fisherman's Wharf, Boudin is a sourdough place, and within 2 blocks from it, all you smell is just the most amazing sourdough smell in your life.
Smells so good.
So it's a real mind trip to be running and smell this amazing sourdough bread and then trying to finish your workout.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so that was fun.
Yeah, that was great. And now on to the feats of endurance. So this is a award that you can win if you're in the Low Tide Boyz Strava Club, so be sure to follow up with that. Obviously, we had the whole Garmin server, ransomware, $10 million situations. Great fodder for memes.
Those memes write themselves.
Now, if you don't, you're like, memes, what are you talking about? You need to go to the Low Tide Boyz Instagram account.
Yeah.
The Low Tide Boyz with a Z, and we're on there, unlimited memes, unlimited LOLs.
Unlimited LOLs. These days. That's right. Yeah, so this week, since, it's Ötillö Engadin week, 2 folks that are in our club, Tobias and G-Flow, they raced the World Series race on Sunday and had a great time. They posted a lot of pictures. I think they even posted a little mini podcast of the race report for themselves. It's on Spotify. We'll link to that in the show notes. And they're a couple funny guys. I guess the day before they climb one of the peaks and just in their swimrun suits, they're just like, swimming through snow and stuff. Just like probably not what you should do on the day before the race. But hey, they had a good time with it, and that's like true to our mantra on all this stuff. So it's great. It's great to see that. I think we also wanted to give a special shout out to the Swimrun Labs crew. They did a 50K distance swim run. And they can't win the feats of endurance because they're co-hosts on our review show. So we'll send them a sticker, but we're not giving them the title because they almost like automatically got a title. But yeah, their description: 12 runs, 11 swims, volcano views, bracing ocean swims, kelp forest, secret cove, single track climb. It's ridiculous. New friends, old friends, PB&J sandwiches. Sounded like,
it's what an epic day.
Yeah.
Exactly what the feats of endurance is all about.
Absolutely. And a little foreshadowing for something we're going to announce later. Talk about a swimrun adventure.
Seriously. Now, there was one picture in there that I will try to link to, or if you follow them on Strava or on Instagram, Annie and Brooke coming across a finish line that didn't even exist, with just like holding each other's hands, and it was like, you just know that they haven't really met up in a while, and it was just great. And to get that whole feeling was really awesome.
Yeah, sounded epic and also cold. Now, before we get onto some cool stuff, we have more cool stuff like our shout out for the week. So this week we're shouting out Patrick from Italy. He was a triathlete. He's a triathlete that was looking for someone else to do, like an Ironman guy, and he saw our pool buoy DIY and has been following us on Instagram, and he did his own pool buoy. He DIY'd it. It was a little rough, but hey, man, that's also part of the rite of passage, is having a crappy first pool buoy DIY experience. And yeah, he made his own pool buoy, found a river and lake and swam in and ran, and he's 100% hooked. So
absolutely,
I think it's pretty cool that I feel like we played a small part in at the start of his swimrun journey, and it sounds like he's gonna have a blast.
Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished for the Low Tide Boyz. It was funny. He immediately, after making this, he's like, oh, I can't wait to do version 2, it's next week. And it's kind of funny because I still have my OG pool buoy and Chris does, and it's like we kind of just give it out to somebody who needs one. So maybe that's what you do with your Gen 1, your first version pool buoy.
Yeah.
Give it to a starter.
Exactly.
We wanted to thank Dirk. He's our newest Patreon on Patreon. Patron.
A patron on Patreon. All the way from I don't know why you can't say that. There's Lasso, we got Patron. Anyway, it's okay. It's all right.
I'll just let you handle those words.
It's okay. But yeah, Dirk is all the way from Germany, so we really appreciate the support. It really helps us just cover the overhead for the show. It gives us more time to do research on stuff. So it's really great. But let's talk about
I'm stoked.
A new special project.
Chipper is stoked.
So I came up with this idea while Chipper was on vacation. I was trying to leave him alone and not do what I usually do, which is like, oh, I got this idea for the show. Just kind of like on the daily.
We
he
do
like
this
talks
to
me
each
down.
other, yeah.
But I could not contain myself. My wife came up with the name for it.
It's great.
We've kind of teased it out on previous shows, but we're calling this the International Swimrun Adventure Guide. Pregnant pause. And the idea is, with races being canceled, a lot of people training on their home turfs. We noticed in our Strava club, there was a lot of teams that kind of went to their usual routes. I'm thinking, Greg and Bronwyn, Walden Pond.
The Swimrun Monks down and
Sanitas.
And the Baywatch team, Elmville Baywatch.
Yep, Huntington Beach. Yeah, so people have their training grounds, and we're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool to compile all these in one place so that if you're on vacation, if you're just looking to do a road trip to go find something.
You're new into the sport, or you don't have an area that is safe for swim run, you can go where other people have gone.
Yep.
And so we're basically creating a repository of all those routes.
Yep.
So we need your help. We're looking at you, like Rosie the Riveter.
Yep.
Or other, war propaganda. We need your help. So we have a form on the homepage that you'll be able to insert your routes and do a little write-up on them and tell us why you like it and all that sort of stuff.
Now, we're calling it international. This was my wife's idea because I was like, oh, yeah, maybe we'll get something for all 50 states. And she's like, well, don't you have all these fans in like Sweden and Finland and England and Japan and Portugal, Israel, Russia? And we're like,
we're nationwide, baby.
And we're like, fuck yeah, like we should. Yeah, why not have it be international if you're on a trip or whatever? So we're asking everybody. The form's pretty short. We're just asking for some key information, like essentially as if you're going to be describing this place where you train to someone else if they were going to go do it. Kind of like an adventure guide, kind of like a,
Lonely Planet guide or something like that. So think if you were traveling and you knew a swim runner in Boston, Massachusetts, which we do. We know, the Boston Red Sox are out there. I would message them on Facebook or whatever and say, hey, where's the swim route to hit up? Here's where I'm staying. We're essentially trying to provide that for you.
Yeah, and we'll have that on our website. So the link is right there. The form's pretty short. As much detail as you want to give is fine. You can remain anonymous if you want. If it's like your secret, Superman lair, you don't want to share it, that's fine too.
Yeah.
We'll find out some other way. Just kidding.
Screenshot your startup activities.
So that's our latest thing that we're taking on, and I'm super stoked about it. I'm
also super stoked. So let's have those things pouring in, and we'll be sure to update them as they come in.
So I need to give a disclaimer. So
there's a lot of disclaimers in the show, right?
On the show, we keep mentioning that we're biased, but actually I feel like I need to give a disclaimer. So my company actually helps produce the Morning Shakeout. We do sponsorship and sales for them. Mm-hmm. So, there is like we have a business relationship, but Mario is also a really dear friend of mine, and I respect him and trust him, and he's like an advisor to me. So he's a client. He's also a friend. But I just wanted to put that out there because, for transparency.
I think that's appreciated. And I think Mario is a rock star guest on any podcast, if friend or foe. Yeah. So I thought this was a really, really solid episode, really great interview with him. Just hearing his approach to, there's tips in there about hearing approach to your own kind of run training, mental aspect, all sorts of stuff. And just kind of Mario's rather pretty cool journey from sort of being a writer for some of these magazines to having, one of the top running podcasts on Spotify, iTunes. It's awesome.
Amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. So if you don't know who Mario is, he's an Olympic level running coach. He's a journalist. He's, as we mentioned, he's a host of the Morning Shakeout podcast, the creator of the newsletter by the same name. He's just an amazing human being. We've known Mario for years, and frankly, like I mentioned, he really has no business being on this show because he's just that awesome. I mean, in this interview, as Chipper mentioned, like we just cover a lot of ground about his coaching background, how he started the newsletter, but then we go into sort of how would he approach a race, how he approach solving problems in swimrun, which or problem solving as a way of approaching how you tackle and understanding race courses. And and then the head game. So I think there's a lot in this episode. I think you pretty much got like Olympic level advice for nothing.
For free.
And
just leave a review on iTunes. And
I think with that, we should just do it. Enjoy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With us today, we have Mario Fraioli. He's a Bay Area run coach. He has his own newsletter and podcast called The Morning Shakeout. Welcome to the show, Mario.
Thank you guys for having me.
So, this show, there's going to be a lot of disclaimers. First disclaimer is that Mario is really good friends with two previous guests, Nate Helming and Michael Olzinski. Before COVID, they had like a weekly coaches corner run that they would do and all this stuff. So Mario, you're last but definitely not least of the holy triumvirate of
the Wednesday coaches crew. Yeah.
The Wednesday coaches crew. So last but not least, but yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of your coaching pedigree and kind of what you're doing now?
Pedigree. Oh, that sounds like so royal. I got into running coaching sort of accidentally right after college. So this is back in 2004. I had a few teammates that I had run with at Stonehill College who wanted to continue competing in cross country and move up in distance to half marathons and such. And they knew I was a big nerd as it related to training. I studied training more than I studied my actual major and minor in college. So they asked me to write them some schedules, and I did, and things went pretty well for them. And I did that for a lot of people for a few years in the early 2000s, like 2004 through 2006. And in 2006, I started managing a run specialty shop in Massachusetts called PR Running. And we had a weekly group run from the store. We had customers coming in and out all day. A lot of those customers would ask training questions, which I was happy to answer. And then some of them would ask me to coach them. And I did. I coached a number of locals in central Massachusetts for a few years. I was also writing training articles for Running Times, Rest and Power, now Runner's World, say what you will about that. But I would get emails from readers who were interested in having me coach them remotely, and a couple of whom I still coach today. And it was always something that I did on the side in addition to whatever I was doing for a full-time job, which was mostly in the writing and editing space. I worked as a copy editor for a newspaper in Massachusetts. I was also the running columnist for that newspaper. Then I managed a run specialty store and did a little bit of freelancing for a while. And then my next gig after that was back into media full-time at Competitor Magazine and .com, where I was for 6 years as a senior editor. But I always worked with a handful of athletes on the side. And then when I moved to San Diego in 2010, I started coaching a group of women which are now called the Prado Racing Team. I still coach many of them. And we had a group that met twice a week in San Diego, usually once midweek for an interval workout, and then on the weekends either for another workout and or long run. And it sort of just snowballed from there. In 2012, I started coaching a gentleman from Costa Rica named Cesar Lozano, and he qualified for the Olympics in London. He ran a 2:17:50 at Chicago and went on to run the marathon for Costa Rica in London 2012. I got to go with him. I was on the coaching staff. That was pretty cool. One of the greatest experiences of my life. And I stayed at Competitor and was coaching, again, handful of athletes on the side till mid-2016. And I left to join a startup here in the Bay Area, which folded in about 3 months. But it was a startup that aimed to make remote coaching more affordable and accessible for a large number of people, but didn't work out. I had to figure out what I wanted to do in terms of a career. My wife gave me a month to figure it out, and I either had to get a new job or figure out how to make it as a writer and a running coach. And that's the route that I decided to go. And I spend about 60 to 70% of my working time now working with 20 to 25 individual athletes around the world. I had 8 women at the Olympic trials this past year in Atlanta. And I also coach a couple groups here in the Bay Area, San Francisco Running Company Racing Team out of Mill Valley, and then the Golden Gate Triathlon Club out of San Francisco. And that is a very abbreviated version of my coaching journey to where I started and where I am now.
We also don't want to forget your podcast journey and your morning shakeout. I believe it started as a newsletter, correct? When did that whole thing come into the fold of this timeline that you just gave us?
Correct. November 17th, 2015, the first issue of the morning shakeout went out to email inboxes, we'll say around the country. I don't know if it was around the world quite yet. I think it hit like maybe 100 people that first week, and now goes out to over 10,000. So we're coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the morning shakeout email newsletter, which I started while I was still working at Competitor Magazine and .com, and it was just a side project. I wouldn't even call it a side hustle. I had zero business ambitions behind it, but it was really a creative outlet for me where I could write about whatever the heck I wanted to write about. I could get opinionated. I could do longer form interviews. I could link to things that had nothing to do with running, which weren't things I could do in my day job at competitormagazine.com. And then when I hit that moment I just described a little while ago in mid 2016, when this whole startup thing kind of failed and I had to figure out how I was going to make a living, I just asked myself, like, what do I want to do? And I wanted to coach and I wanted to write. And then I asked myself who I wanted to write for. And being an editor on the other side of things, I knew how hard it would be to do the freelance thing. And I had zero interest in that. There's a lot of like pitching and rejection, and it takes you a long time to get paid, and you get paid pennies on the dollar. So I knew I didn't want to go that route, but I was loving this newsletter that I was putting out every week, and the audience was slowly growing. And I had to figure out how to turn that into something that I could do as my career. And I'm fortunate that I was able to do that. And then the podcast started in late 2017, December 2017. The first episode was with Scott Fauble, who ran 209 low at the Boston Marathon in 2019. And it was a natural extension of what I was already doing with the morning shakeout. I was doing these longer form interviews that I called going long, but they weren't podcasts. I would record them and then have them transcribed into text, and I'd put that out with a bunch of, photos embedded within the text of the interview. But I started listening to a lot more podcasts myself, and I could not find the running podcast that really kind of spoke to me and was the one that I wanted to listen to every week. So I decided to create it myself, and I knew that I had both the connections and the chops to do it. And here we are, coming up on 120 episodes later, almost 2 million downloads. And it's something that I put out every week alongside the newsletter. And those two things are the other half of how I make my living and spend my working time in addition to my coaching duties.
That's not that dissimilar from the Low Tide Boyz. When we were looking for a Swimrun podcast, we also didn't find anything that really spoke to us. I mean, there weren't
anything for that matter.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting. So again, I'm super biased, but when you started the podcast, did you have a lot of people being like, hey, you should really be doing a podcast? Like, you would be great at interviewing people. Like, this is something you should really pursue? Or was it mostly sort of like you decided, I'm going to want to try this, see what happens?
Well, I told myself for the longest time that I should be doing a podcast because I knew that I could do it. And I bought the mic. I mean, God, I bought the mic like at least a year before I even put out an episode. And it took me that long to actually take the next steps and line up guests and record some episodes, because I got hung up on the details like any idiot does. You're like, what am I going to call it? What am I going to use for intro music? What's the structure of the show going to be? I spent an embarrassing amount of time just stressing out over those details before I even recorded an episode of the podcast. And then I finally snapped out of it, and I was like, well, what is this about? Like, it's about the guests that I bring on and their stories that they can share with my audience, and my job as the host, so much about the intro and the music and the structure, it's to bring that out of them. So I finally just decided, I have this brand, the Morning Shakeout. This will be an extension of that. It makes sense. I don't know why it took a year for that to dawn on me. And then I had the equipment, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to start, much like I started the news. I had to go back to my origins of the newsletter. I started the newsletter. I called it the Morning Shakeout. I had no logo, no imagery, no real structure to the newsletter. I put it out, and then it sort of found its own style as it went on. So I decided to take that approach with the podcast. So the first, 20 or so episodes, there is no music, there is no intro, there's no ads, there's nothing. It just goes right into, hey, Scott Fauble, welcome to the Morning Shakeout podcast. And it just would play all the way through to the very end. I don't think I had an outro or anything like that at the end. It was just the interview, but it caught on, and it gained an audience relatively quickly. I've been working with the same audio producer, John Summerford, shout out to him, on every episode since the very beginning. And he was really instrumental in helping put some structure to the show and creating the music and blending all that together. And now I like to think it's a more highly produced and polished product.
Having listened to many episodes, I will tell you that it is.
But thank you.
I'm a bit biased, I guess, too, myself.
Yeah, you're definitely. There's just a lot of biases in this episode. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I really love about the morning shakeout, it's especially the newsletter, which that's what I started. When you announced it, I signed up. It really is like it's like a conversation that you're having, like that you would have on sort of a morning run with your friends, where you were just talking shop,
shooting the shit and stuff,
talking about what happened at Worlds or whatever. Was that like intentional on your part to kind of have it be sort of like your musings on the running space as you see it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, back when I was in college, we often practiced in the afternoons, and that's when we would do, I mean, almost all of our runs are in the afternoon. Certainly our workouts were in the afternoons. And by the time I got to my senior year, my mileage was a lot higher. So I was doing double runs where on the mornings of our key workouts, I would go out and run like 3 to 5 miles real easy. And sometimes I could get one of my teammates to go along with me. And it was just this really like casual jog, and we would just shoot the shit about whatever. Usually our training, races we had coming up, things that were happening in the sport. And I mean, it's still to this day, I mean, we didn't come up with the term, but it's called a shakeout run. Like you just go for a little shakeout. Oftentimes we would race, especially on the track at night in college, and you would go for like a little shakeout run that morning. And oftentimes we do it as a team, and it was always like just kind of loose, and sometimes people would get opinionated and go off about something. And I mean, I do that to this day. My poor wife has to listen to most of it right now during quarantine since she's my most regular running partner. But yeah, that's sort of that is the origins of the morning shakeout as a newsletter, and that's the vibe I wanted it to have. I really wanted it to feel very conversational. As I was describing earlier, it's a place where I often will get opinionated about something. If I've read something interesting, that's where I'll share it and maybe provide a little bit of commentary. So it's really intentional in that way.
Cool. Well, let's transition a little bit into more swim run stuff, since that's our audience. I mean, everybody who's doing swim run is doing some running, and my
disclaimer, I have never done a swim run and probably never will. No offense.
Well, never say never, but
I will never say never.
Huh?
But yeah, as as a obviously a super elite running coach, one of the things that swim runners have to deal with is sort of managing efforts and tackling courses where every single race course is going to be unique. I guess similar to sort of the marathon circuit, every major race is going to have its features that you need to prepare for. And I was wondering if you could give us kind of like a primer on, how if you're going to see a course of first impression, and let's say it's like 18 miles of total running with 3,000 feet of climbing, and it's like at elevation or something, like how would you go by sort of designing sort of a training program or key workouts for I guess any event that's of first impression?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I look at racing regardless of what the discipline is, whether it's a marathon, ultramarathon, triathlon, swim run, cycling, you name it. It's a giant exercise in problem solving. That's all racing is when it boils down to it. There's going to be 100 or 1,000 little things that come up during the race, and a lot of times these things are happening instantly, little problems that you have to solve. And that's the perspective that I look at things from as a coach. And I think a good parallel to this is when I started coaching ultra runners back in 2014 when I moved to the Bay Area. I had never run an ultra to that point. I ran my first 50K within 3 months of moving here, but I didn't follow ultra running. I never coached an ultra runner, and I had a few approach me about helping them get ready for these races that were on their calendar. And that's exactly how I looked at it. I just stepped back and I said, all right, well, these races that they're training for, what are the demands of the race? You look at the distance, you look at, past results and see, okay, here's how long it takes athletes of different calibers to finish these things. Here is where it's located in terms of terrain. Maybe there's altitude, maybe there's technical trails, maybe there's a lot of elevation gain and loss. Maybe it's hot because it's in the middle of the summer. Maybe it's freezing cold and raining because it's in the wintertime. Like whatever it is, like just understanding like what it is that the athlete's going to be up against. And I think that's important because the way that I train athletes for races, whether they are professional or elite, or they are more of an age grouper getting into something for the first time, is I work backwards. So it all has to start with like, okay, well, what are we building toward? And I mean, we're always building towards something. Even when you finish a race, you're going to move on to the next one. But we're a lot of times like in these cycles of like, all right, 8 weeks for this, 16 weeks for this, like, you know, and everything builds upon itself. But, you know, I tend to work backwards when we're building up to something, or if I'm looking at, I mean, I try to look at a season for a lot of my athletes, like, okay, what's the next year going to look like, and how are we going to put these building blocks together? And once we establish, like, okay, what are the demands of the race that they're going to be up against? What are the tools that they're going to need to have in their box so that they can get themselves out of any situation that they encounter during the race? And we work backward from that. And thinking about training, you know, the closer we are to the race, the more specific the training is going to be, generally in like the 6 to 8 weeks beforehand. I mean, the 2 weeks before a race, you're not going to gain anything. So at that point, we're just sharpening and making sure people are getting to the start line healthy and feeling ready to go. But in the 6 to 8 weeks before that, like, we're really focusing on the specificity. You know, if it's a race that has, as you described, like, you know, 18,000 feet of elevation gain and loss, like, we're going to try to simulate that, not replicate it, but simulate it in training through some of the key sessions that they're doing, trying to get them, you know, in an environment that is close to the one that they're going to be racing in. We're looking at the amount of, like, you know, vertical gain per mile and seeing if we can simulate that. Same thing with loss. You know, in a situation like Swimrun, I don't have experience in it as an athlete, but looking at the races and knowing sort of, you know, how they're structured, you're, you know, essentially in and out of the water, you know, all day. I mean, I think some of your training should mimic that. And it should, you know, the other condition should also mimic what you're going to, you know, what you're going to encounter, you know, during the race. Like, that specificity is really key. Backing up from that, that's very demanding. That's very demanding work, regardless of the level that you're at, and you can't just jump into it. So what does your foundation look like? What are we layering that on top of? And for me, like, I call that fundamental fitness. And, you know, for the runners that I work with, that's really developing, you know, kind of the ends of the fitness spectrum that are like the furthest removed from whatever the specifics of the race that they're training for. So for someone who's doing like ultra distance type stuff, you know, for a while before we build that, or we get into that specific block of training, you know, we're working on the opposite end of the spectrum, their speed, you know, maybe power, the things that aren't very specific to the demands of the race that they're prepping for, because that's going to help just give your general level of fitness a really nice boost. You're going to work on becoming a stronger, more robust athlete. Like, basically, you are creating that foundation that you're building the rest of the house upon. So I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but that's kind of the approach that I would take. But I mean, essentially, I'd be looking at, like, you know, the athletes that I work with, you know, they would tell me, like, usually when an athlete comes to me, that, you know, they have something that, or at least an idea of, like, all right, this is what I would like to do. Like, maybe they have a specific race they've already signed up for, races that they've signed up for, and we're plotting out a path to figure out how to tackle those. Or, you know, they come to me and they're like, hey, you know, I've run 10 marathons. I'd like to move up to ultras over the next year. Like, you know, where do I start? And then, you know, then we kind of identify, like, what those races are. But once we do, you know, we start working backwards so that we're making sure we can be as ready as possible for them.
Wow, that was super insightful. And there was a really interesting part that you emphasized, and I want to touch on that a little bit more, because I think, you know, swimrun is a newer sport, especially in the United States. And when you have something new, it's just sort of human nature that there's a lot of, you know, fear, or fear of the unknown, I guess. And when you mentioned the part about replicating, not duplicating, or whatever you said, but essentially, if
replicating, not simulating.
Yeah. So I would be really curious. So, for example, like let's say one run leg has a really steep hill that's 20% grade that goes on for a mile. I would assume you're not going to go and prescribe 5 hill repeats of that exact hill. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about the philosophy about why the simulation of it, because I think a lot of people will get really scared and like, I need to run exactly a marathon before the marathon so I know I can do it, sort of thing. Like I'm sure for a lot of probably more age group type athletes, you kind of get more of that. So that's where that question comes from.
Yeah, I mean, in a specific instance like that, I mean, you got to think about what are you doing before you hit that hill. So you're obviously like in the water. So you're going from this like, basically like, horizontal position, all of a sudden you're vertical, and then you're going like, straight up. And if you're doing that for the first time in a race, it's gonna like punch you in the face, and you're not gonna be ready for that. So like figuring out a way, in training where, maybe you're not doing the whole thing, but you're working on like going, okay, I'm going from like, swimming at a fairly like high intensity. You could do that for much shorter than you're actually in the water, right into a specific like hill repeat that's a lot shorter than, what you're actually going to hit in the race, and doing that over and over and over again. Like, I mean, that could be like a creative workout or way to do that. But yeah, I mean, you can't, you don't have to cover, if you're covering the distance or like basically like, especially something like as novel as Swimrun, where a lot of these courses are unique, like you're not going to go out and replicate that exactly before the race, because then why the heck would you do the race? Like you've already like sort of done it in training. So it's finding those specific pieces of it, and finding ways to like simulate that, in training, like those demands, and working on the skills that you're going to need. So I think about like, okay, if there's a race that, I know there's a swim run on Catalina, and a lot of that run course, because I'm familiar with those trails, like they kind of go straight up or they go straight down. And I think about like the mechanics of that, right? So it's like, that's not really, it's not like running on flat ground. So, you've got to figure out a way to, sort of simulate like what that's going to be like from like a biomechanical standpoint. And I think that's so important, and a lot of people like lose sight of that because they're like, oh, it's just going uphill. Well, it's like, well, think about the mechanics of uphill. How can you move more efficiently? Thinking about your nutrition throughout. It's like, obviously you're in the water, there's not really much you can take. So if you've got this long hill, like, are you going to go right into it without drinking or eating? So it's like thinking about those things as much as it is like the breakdown of the workout itself in terms of duration and intensity, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that was a great explanation. Thank you. And you're also kind of relying a little bit, it sounds like, on that base level of fitness that you spoke about as well. Like there's a certain amount of trust that you have to have in yourself or in your coach or whoever you're working with, that base level of fitness is going to get you up to that hill, even though you haven't exactly done the totality of the mileage or whatever. So
yeah, well, fitness is the most important thing that you can bring with you to the starting line. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it'll help you get through a lot of them. I mean, the fitter you are, the more you're going to be able to handle. I mean, it's no different than a lot of sea-level athletes who go to altitude and they wonder like, oh, well, what's the ideal amount of time that I should be there before the race so that I'm acclimated? Well, I mean, it's going to depend on the athlete and how soon they can get there and how quickly they adapt. But I can tell you this, the fitter that athlete is, the better off they're going to be regardless of when they arrive. Like fitness is going to trump a lot of other details.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny you mention it that way. I think, when I was training for my first 50 miler, I kind of stopped doing all the speed stuff I was doing. And I was just like, I just got to get long. And I lost so many gears in terms of speed, because it was like, oh, well, I'm just hiking all the uphills because it's a super long day. So kind of lost the ability to run uphill.
Yeah, why would you go on the track and do mile repeats or something? Because it didn't make any sense.
And it was, in hindsight, that was just a really stupid thing to do. So when Chipper was training for his first 50
biggest
milers,
mistakes ultra runners make. Yeah.
Oh my God. So when Chipper was training, I was like, no, we got to keep doing the speed. We got to hit these ninja loops hard and all this stuff, because it was just, I totally regretted that approach. And I think since then I've been paid way more attention to just making sure that I have gears that I can just a big engine that can just handle a lot of stuff.
Yeah, same thing with swimming and stuff too. You just don't want to go zone 2 all the time because that's going to be the only gear that you got. And when you need to go to zone 4 to pass somebody or, ditch somebody, you're just not going to have it because it ain't there.
It ain't there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer just in general, and I think this applies to a wide range of sports. But you've got to train the entire spectrum. You can't just do volume all the time. You can't just do speed all the time. And as Chipper just mentioned a little while ago, you can't just be stuck in the middle all the time either. So you've got to find for you, like, all right, everyone's got sort of that quote unquote zone that they feel most comfortable in or they feel most competent in, but you've got to hit them all, because when you're in a race, even a really long race, all of it matters and all of it is going to help you in some way. But I think, whether it's triathlon, whether it's ultra running, whether it's swim run, people just look at these things, especially the long, like, seems like everyone's going like longer in everything these days. Like, well, it's all about volume. I just got to go long. I just got to go long. And it's like, you got to go long at the right times, but you've got to have a lot of other tools in your belt as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So when you go to kind of structure some of your athletes, this is strictly from the kind of running lens here, but let's say someone's running 3 to 4 times a week. How would you kind of lay that out? I know most people without a coach or whatever are just thinking, oh, I'll run, a couple times before work or on my lunch break, and then Saturday's my big run and I'll run 10 miles or whatever they're shooting for. Where do you kind of see the speed aspect, working on those gears, and then where do the other runs fit in when you're thinking about prescribing a running plan for somebody?
Yeah, so if we're working on 4 days a week, I believe at least, one of those runs, depending on who you are and where you are in your training cycle, should be a longer run of some sort. And that's usually going to take up a good, a good chunk of your week, a majority of it. And for me, like, I have never, especially for more experienced athletes, I mean, I think beginners are definitely a different story, but for more experienced athletes, don't waste your long run. There are going to be days when you should go out there and do, longer, I guess, steadier distance. But I always try to make the long runs some sort of quality effort, whether that's putting in short intervals, whether it's like, even doing longer intervals sometimes, or, progression run, faster finish type of deal. So I generally tend to mix like some degree of quality into the long runs. I'd have one other run, earlier in the week that is definitely more quality, high quality interval session, warm up, cool down, good chunk of work somewhere in the middle. And the other two are usually just going to be filler aerobic runs, like straight up recovery, really low heart rate, low effort level, not putting much into it. But, generally focusing the priorities on that kind of midweek, we'll call it workout. I mean, it could be intervals, could be a tempo run, could be hills, could be some combination of those things. And then a long run on the weekend, especially for folks who are training for, I know a lot of these swim run events tend to be pretty long. Like, that's a good chunk of your week. And that's probably going to be most specific to the event that you're training for. Mm-hmm. So, like, let's make sure that we are building, some amount of quality, some amount of specificity into that.
And then so to build on that one again, so let's say you're doing a hilly course, so then maybe your midweek one would be more hill repeats or something kind of based on whatever your upcoming event is. Is that how you kind of think about that sort of stuff? Or are you always, even if you're running the CIM or something, some really flat marathon, are you still working in hill repeats because they build other muscles up, or what's your approach to that?
No, I mean, if it's a flatter race, when we're in that specific phase I was talking about earlier, I wouldn't say we cut that stuff out completely, but we definitely deprioritize it. But we're doing a lot more of that stuff like in that foundational phase. Okay. I mean, right now, for example, like we're, in the thick of COVID-19, there are no real races happening anywhere, and we're not certain when they're going to return with any kind of regularity. I have a lot of my athletes doing a lot more, like even the ones that mostly run, flatter marathons, half marathons, do some track stuff, don't do these big, long, epic, hilly things. We're doing a lot more hill work right now, and it's a mix of short hills, long hills, and it's just helping them. We can't really do that when we're in, a build after build after build, because they're not really specific to the events that they're training for. Like, we do a little bit of it, like kind of in the foundational phase, but even that is fairly limited. You're talking like, sometimes like 4 to 6 weeks if we're lucky. But now we can like really dedicate a good chunk of time where they're doing like, somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks, where every week we've got like a dedicated hill session in there. So, not for the athletes training for flatter races, it's generally not something that I'll have them do with any kind of regularity when we're in the thick of their specific training.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Well, I think it's fascinating. You're not very much exposed to the swimrun world, but the swimrun coaches that we've spoken with pretty much have echoed everything that you've said. So you're definitely in
methodologies
line.
Are there.
Yeah, the
sure.
the methodologies are there. But I think another thing I wanted to chat with you about. I mean, you're well known as being like not just a great coach and writing programs and things like that, but also like the philosophical, psychological sort of head game. Can you talk a little bit about that, sort of how that developed and sort of how you develop sort of your philosophy around making sure people are sort of mentally prepared for events, not just physically?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, that's a standpoint that I come to coaching from. I majored in philosophy and psychology in college. That's my academic background. That's one of just my primary areas of interest in general. And when I take on new athletes, the first thing I do before I even look at their training is I get to know them as a person and try to understand what makes them tick. So that really drives the way that I work with athletes. I don't actually think I'm that great of a program writer. And I don't think that's really that hard, honestly. That's not to disparage like, anyone out there who comes from, more of a scientific background. But I mean, a lot of that stuff, it's inconsequential if the athlete isn't in the right place mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, because these are human beings. They're not robots. You can't program an athlete to go and do something every day of the week. Things come up. We all have lives. We have families. Most of us have jobs outside of sport that we're working around, and all these various things that are going to, affect what we do as athletes. So the way that I approach coaching, and I say this with all my athletes, even the professionals, I'm like, hey, this serious pursuit of running that you are on is great, but it's got to complement everything else that you're doing in life. And the time that you're putting into training and racing, it's got to fit in somehow with everything else that you're doing in life. Because if it's thrown off the balance too much, that's not healthy, and you're not going to be the best athlete that you can be. And on the flip side, everything else that you're doing outside of this pursuit of running, not that I have any control over it, but you've got to make sure that it is supporting this pursuit of running that you're doing. Like, there's got to be a harmony between the two. And that's something that I'm paying as much or more attention to with the athletes that I work with, as I am to, what they're doing on a daily basis on the track or on the trails, or what their data is telling me, in their training log. So, I mean, that's just from a philosophical standpoint, like that's where I'm coming at it from. But I think for, the athletes themselves, it's getting them to understand that. It's getting them to understand, like, hey, there is no magic formula for whatever it is that you're doing. Even the scientific process, any of the physiologists and coaches who come from physiological background will tell you, like, this is, the scientific process is one of trial and error. Even things that have been proven in the labs, over and over and over again. Like, we don't race in a lab, we don't race in a vacuum. So it's like, if something doesn't go to plan, like we've got to adjust. So it sounds like pretty, like, you're like, oh yeah, that makes like a ton of sense. But when athletes are in it, when they get their training program, like, they want to check all the boxes. They think like, all right, well, if I do this, and this, then the result is going to be that. And oftentimes, like, more often than not, that's not how things play out. So I see my job as a coach is like guiding them through that and helping them work through, a lot of those highs and a lot of those lows. that they're going to experience, on a day-to-day basis, but also throughout the course of, their athletic journey.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense if you're burning the candle on both ends and you're just completely out of balance, like something is going to give. It could be your racing, it could be your personal life, it could be your job. Do you have any sort of tips that you sort of share with your athletes to kind of help them get into the right headspace before a race?
Yeah, and I'll get to that. Backing up from there, I mean, when I take on a new athlete, one of the first questions I ask them is like, why do you do this? And it's not a complicated question, but it's not one that many athletes actually sit there and contemplate for too long. Like, it can be a fleeting thought from time to time, but I think it's important for an athlete to be able to step back and remember that why they got into sports, or sports in general in the first place, or running, cycling, swimming, swim run, triathlon, whatever it is, because it's easy to lose sight of that, especially when you've been at it for a while. And to answer your question, Chris, I'll also ask them that question a lot of times before race, especially if I can sense that they're putting too much pressure on this like one day, and they've put all their eggs in the basket, so to speak. I mean, I was telling you about the 8 women I had at the Olympic trials earlier this year. Like, that was a huge accomplishment for all of them. And for a lot of them, it was the biggest thing that they'd ever done, in running. And none of them, were actually trying to make the Olympic team, but they wanted to have the best race that they possibly could. And I wanted them to have the best race that they possibly could. And you're in this environment where everyone who's in the race is really good. They've had to run really fast to get there, and you want to be able to hold your own, and that can be a pressure cooker of a situation. And for all of them, in the lead up to it, I had them go back to their beginnings as an athlete, and all of them have different journeys. Some of them had just gotten into running in the few years prior. Some of them have been running for 20 years, if not more. And it's like, when you're putting all this pressure on yourself, all of them, I had to remind, like, to ask themselves, like, why did you get into this, in the first place? Because, none of it was to qualify for the Olympic trials. It was because my friends were on the cross country team and I enjoyed like hanging out with them, after school, or I liked the feeling that, running gave me after I had kids. And it was just like this feeling of freedom, and that helps ground people. It really does help ground people. And, that's, I've always said, like, my number one job as a coach is to provide perspective. And leading into a race, when I can sense that athletes are on edge and they're putting a lot of pressure on themselves, I've got to put it in perspective for them. And, aside from having them ask that question of themselves, like, I'm asking them, like, what are they still worked up about? And actually having them like vocalize it, sometimes for the first time, or write it down, in their journal, like literally unloading it, can make a big difference, because a lot of times they'll look at that and be like, well, that was stupid. Why was I putting all this pressure on myself when there's really no reason to? Because, if athletes are going to the line, too emotional, feeling all kinds of pressure, constrained in some way, they're not going to perform at their best. I've got to get them there, like, feeling relaxed, feeling confident, but at the same time, like, just having a healthy mindset about, the entire thing. And it's often, as I just described, like, getting them to remember, like, why they got into it, in the first place, what it is, that, like, just having them remind themselves, like, hey, who else helped you to get here? Like, this wasn't a solitary pursuit, and oftentimes that's family and friends. And I think that can just like help give them the perspective that they need, that it's like, okay, well, they can let go. Like, they can be like, all right, well, I want this race to go well, but if it does or it doesn't define me as a person or as an athlete. And even for, the professionals, getting them to embrace that type of mindset can oftentimes lead to, a big breakthrough, because as athletes who are training for these races, I mean, yeah, we want them to be fun and we have a good time, but a lot of us put unnecessary amounts of pressure on ourselves going into an event. And, for me, it's just like finding these different ways, and it's different for everybody to diffuse that pressure, because when I can do that or help the athlete do that, then they can really start to see the possibilities of what can happen.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with that. It's almost like
a reset button.
Yeah, almost. or like you need to remember that this is a blessing to be able to do this, and it needs to, or it should be something that enhances your life and brings you joy. And I mean, I remember when I was sort of just an age group triathlete and I was just putting a ton of pressure on myself, it stopped being fun for a couple of races. And that's sort of when I knew that's like, well, I need to take a break or I need to do something else, because it was just, if I didn't get my time, I'd be super disappointed and sulky and just like a little bitch.
And that's when Chris and I and other people kind of, we didn't come up with it, but we really like embraced the, hey, no one gives a fuck about this except you. Like, if you
say that a lot to people.
Yeah, if you did a 4:30 on a half Ironman, I'd be so happy for you. If you did a 6:30 and you had to walk it, I'm still happy for you. Like, I'm not going to judge you or anything like that.
I have a funny Mario story, right? So we're at track. I think it was with Golden Gate, and I think you just ran your worst Boston Marathon time. And I think it was you, me, and it was like you, me, and Nate. And you were saying, it's like, oh yeah, I kind of sucked out there. I only ran like a 2:42, and we were like, oh, poor Mario. Like everyone just started ripping on you, and you're a really good sport about it. But he was like, hey man, I remember your response. You're like, hey, it's all relative, man.
Yeah, it is. Like, regardless of that's the thing about these sports, right? Like, there is more often than not a time next to your name at the end, and you can see how you stack up. And not even in races. I mean, if you're on Strava and looking at social media all the time, like, it's easy to fall into that comparison trap. And I see that with a lot of athletes that I work with. And big part of what I do as a coach is getting them to free themselves from that trap. And it's easy to get sucked into it. I mean, I remember, it was the last race that I was at before everything shut down, but the Olympic trials, I mean, telling some of these women, I'm like, whether you run a personal best or, you have a terrible race for whatever reason, like, who's going to be at the finish line when you cross? And it's like, oh, well, my husband and my 2 kids. And and you know what? They're going to be just as excited for you, regardless of how it, how it turns out. So let go of that pressure that you're putting on yourself to, hit these exact splits, because by doing that, like, you're kind of setting yourself up for disaster, and we're trying to set you up here for success. And it is like, it's all relative, but I mean, I think just like trying to maintain perspective or finding people, whether it's coaches, training partners, your own family, that can help provide that perspective for you is so important.
Well, it's funny because I think one of the reasons that Chipper and I, if I can speak for him, really like Swimrun, it's we're sort of each other's accountability partner. But in these races, I mean, it's a team sport. You have to finish together. You're responsible for each other. If one of you can't continue,
the race is
you
over for
DNF.
both. Yeah.
And you're supposed to take care of other people if you see people in distress. It's almost like, the built-in sort of measure of how we do is shared, which kind of takes you out of your own head. Like, if you're having a bad day, if I'm having a bad day, I still have to be there for Chipper, and he has to be there for me. And, if the race is long enough, it could be flipped. I could feel great, then I feel like crap, then I feel great again. And I think it's a really interesting piece about the sport, because
you got to show up.
You got to show up, and you're doing it because for your teammate. Whereas like, marathon racing, road racing, and triathlon, it's essentially just a time trial. And this is just it kind of does allow you to focus on what's really important, which is like taking care of each other while you're hopefully having fun.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And it's cool that Swimrun's coming into, our endurance sports world here in the U.S., or was coming in a big way recently. I love that team aspect of it. And I mean, I come from a team sports background, grew up playing basketball, but even in college, like running cross country, which is very much like a scholastic thing, right? You run cross country in high school and college. And I mean, there are cross country races after school, but after people get out of school, even if you're not a professional, but the coolest thing about it is it's a team sport. And if you really, I mean, yeah, you're running as an individual and someone's going to win the race and there's top 10 and all that stuff. But, it was all about the team. And I mean, that's what I loved about cross country in college. It was one of my favorite memories is like you were fighting for every spot because that helped your team. And I remember races where I would feel absolutely terrible and like everyone's running as an individual. You're not like swim run where you're stuck together the entire race. But if you're feeling pretty terrible, you're like, all right, if I quit now, like I'm letting down my whole team. And there's something really powerful about that. And, I as a coach, like with my athletes, like I have to remind them, I'm like, who's your team? In the kind of figurative sense, because more often than not, when you're racing a marathon, you're racing a half marathon, you're racing an ultra. I mean, there's no team scoring. It's you. And there's something that's cool about that too. It's you against the elements, you against the course, you against other people. Mm-hmm. But I often tell people think of their team, and their team can be like, as I was saying earlier, it's like, your husband and your kids and your family. It's your coach. It can be your body workers, your best friends. Like I was telling some of my athletes at the Olympic trials, I'm like, hey, every mile is dedicated to someone. So when you're feeling like shit in mile 17 and you're like, I don't know, like think of whoever mile 17 is dedicated to on your team. And do you want to let that person down? And you're going to, nope, I don't want to. So you're going to find a way to keep pushing. And I think that's like such a cool element of, swim run. And again, maybe that is reason why someday I will do it. So I can have that team aspect of it. But yeah, if you're, a lot of people are okay with letting themselves down, but it's a lot harder to let someone else down that you care about, especially someone who's put in a lot of work towards something.
I concur. I mean, you left Chris speechless, which is pretty hard to do.
That's funny.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if a total stranger you hooked your tether to a total stranger and you're like, let's go, I still think, obviously Chris and I have a very deep relationship over many years and we're friends and lots of layers onto that like probably is a lot stronger than somebody that you met an hour before. But
sure.
But there is, it is just a little bit of that, I guess, that swim run magic that we keep talking about, I feel.
Yeah. And if I can go off on a little tangent, you can cut it out. Please, if you want.
Totally.
I don't mean to get political on your show, but if we could do that as a society today, like think of it. I've said this before. Think of like what we're going through right now. Everything as a team sport. The decisions that you make don't just affect you. They affect everyone in, your household, your neighborhood, your town, your area, your state, your country, your world. Like if you, and it does, like those decisions do, like you might not realize it, immediately, but we're trying to play a team game here, but you've got a lot of folks who are just like, focus on themselves as individuals. And I mean, I think that's something by and large that, is hurting our society. But if we all start thinking more like team players, in all aspects of our life, I think we're going to be a lot better off in the long run, no pun intended.
Yeah, I know exactly. I think it's probably from.
So what you're saying is wear a mask.
Well, it was like from your newsletter. I think it was like Bill Russell. I think it was Bill Russell. Like he was talking about how like, you would show up, you would do whatever you had to do for your teammate, and that was the big motivator. It wasn't like individual stats. It was like how do you lift up your teammate. And make them the best they can be, because if they're doing the same for you, basically everyone's getting better. And how as a society, like there's no capacity to do that at this point.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say there's no capacity, because we are seeing it happen where people are, as best they can given the situation we're in, trying to help out other people, and that's wonderful. But we need to do it on a much wider scale. Like more people need to take on their responsibility as a teammate, because it's cliche, but it's true. We're all in this together. And the same thing applies to racing. And I mean, I think that's why clubs are important. I mean, I think that's why I love sports like cross country. I think that's why something like Swimrun is really cool. It's that team element. Like, it's not about you. You're actually in it for something bigger than yourself. And anytime you're doing something that isn't just for you, it's for something that's bigger than yourself. More people are going to benefit, and you're going to be at, just like Bill Russell said, like, you're going to be at your best. Like, you giving your best is going to bring the best out in someone else, and that is something that, there's something magnetic about that, and we want that to spread. So,
amen to that.
Well, Mario, we have borrowed your time for too long, I think. We have dropped some serious knowledge bombs on us, and the insights and just your methodology and thoughts on some stuff, I think, are really going to help a lot of people. And I really appreciated your outlook, or we both did, I know. But again, we're biased.
Well,
yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I appreciate your bias and appreciate you letting me ramble here for, I don't know, the last 45 minutes to an hour.
No, it's been great, and we'll make sure in the show notes to let people give the link for people to check out the morning shakeout, and a link to the show, to the podcast. It's a really, really great podcast. Again, I'm biased, but I think it's fantastic.
It is a top tier running podcast, and you don't have to believe us. iTunes and Spotify even think so.
Yeah,
so
they'll tell you.
It's beyond the Low Tide Boyz. You trust them. And then where can people find you?
The morning shakeout.com.
Okay.
MarioFraioli.com is my personal site, and then at the AM Shakeout on all the socials.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Cool,
so
man.
much for being on the show, man.
Thank you guys for having me. Never would I have thought that I'd be on a Swimrun podcast, but if I had to be on one, I'm glad it was with the Low Tide Boyz.
Well, it's
Well.
also the only one in the United States. So
Add that to your CV.
Thank you guys so much. This was fun.
All right, cheers. Thank you for listening to the Low Tide Boyz, a Swimrun podcast. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and leave a review on iTunes if you're so inclined.
you can also sign up for a newsletter at lowtideboyz.com. That's boys with a Z. And check out our meme page at The Low Tide Boyz on Instagram. If you have any questions or suggestions for the show, drop us an email at lowtideboyz@gmail.com.
We'd like to thank Writing Easy Records for our show music, and of course our wives for their support and tolerance of our swimrun activities, hobbies, and other bullshit we do.
Finally, you can support our efforts on Patreon. Until next time, get out there and go for a swim.
And then a run,
And then another swim.
then another run,
And then another swim.
and then run to the finish line. And just keep going until you're done.
Yes, or
Until
run
you
to
cross the finish line.
or run to the car
Or run to your car.
somewhere. Just keep running.
Peace.